Good afternoon. This is the fourth session, focusing on food security, safety and resilience on the agri-food supply chains. Previously, there was a lot of discussion on the primary production and mention of foods. This session is, the entire session is devoted to food and agri-food. We have distinguished speakers who will enlighten us with their presentations.
Του Ελληνικού Γεωργικού Οργανισμού Dimitra, τον κύριο
We'll start with Dr. Serko Haroutounian, Chairman and from the Hellenic Agricultural Organization, ELGO, Dimitra. Then Dr. Dimitrios Vlachos, Director of LACSM, Professor of the Supply Chain Management from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. And along with Dr. Eleftherios Iakovou, Director of Manufacturing and Logistics Innovation from Texas A&M Engineering. They will talk to us about the food safety technologies for resilient farm-to-fork supply chains. At this point, let me say that Dr. Iakovou will be with us online. Then we have Dr. Panagiotis Skandamis, member of the BIOHAZ panel from the European Food Safety Authority. So he's here in this capacity as a member of the BIOHAZ. He's also professor. And then last but not least, we will have Mr. Ruud from the Netherlands, who will be with us online. And he's from the Netherlands Space Office. Let us start with Dr. Haroutounian, calling him to the podium. Let me remind you that so far we've talked about primary production, circular economy, digital technologies in the agri-food sector, and it's up to you at this point to explain to us how ELGO, Dimitra, addresses food security in Greece's agri-food chain. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Since I'm going to speak about ELGO, Dimitra, and what we do about all that, let me start, first of all, by explaining who ELGO, Dimitra is. This is one of the 4 agencies supervised by the Ministry of Agricultural Development. The aim is to provide certification of agricultural food. So it's got all the agri labels, biological, organic farming, all the labeling. It's also there for the balance of the stock taking of the milk and livestock in Greece. It has all the training which is necessary. And all over Greece, it has 11 agricultural institutes covering the entire range of the sector, and they're scattered throughout the territory. So, being a professor of the agronomy department, one might expect a presentation on very specific things, very impressive things, like planting on the moon and underwater cultures, etc. But I'm not going to speak about that. I'm going to speak about the policies implemented currently by ELGO and the programs we have, and these are more down to earth and more easily applicable, let's say. So as a starting with agriculture today, I would like to sum up a lot of what was previously said by the other speakers, that the increase of agriculture has to face 3 threats. Number 1 being climate change, number 2 being the loss of biodiversity, and number 3 being the abandonment of the sector. In Greece, we've lost more than 20% of the agricultural land the past 30 to 40 years. Along with these threats, however, we also have challenges. One of them is the overpopulation. Back in the 60s, we read in the books that the population was 1.5 billion. Now it's 7.8 billion, marching on towards 10 billion people. And this needs to be taken into account. Another thing has to do with the preferences, food preferences. A few years ago, the Chinese started eating more meat, and that shook the entire planet. And then we also have the safe food issue. Alongside that, we have some extraordinary events such as COVID-19. So what does ELGO do about that? We're part of the committee of the ministry, and there we've determined the main food inputs, the countries we depend on, and on a monthly basis we measure together with the Greek embassies what we import, what they produce, and if there's a difference there, so far it's not been more than 10 to 20%, that means that we need to provide some alternatives. And we do have contingency plans if there's any type of food missing, how we can actually replace that. But that was extraordinary events, as we said. For the threats, let's speak about the first threat, which was mentioned. The first threat is climate change. What can we do? We could look at the zoning or the clustering. It was mentioned earlier on by the representative from ALGO. In Crete, on the island of Crete, there used to be orange trees. And currently, they have other types of cultures which are doing a lot better than the oranges, because due to the climate change, the produce there is not as good as in the past. Then the extreme weather conditions. I heard that there should be some financing in the case of disasters. What do we need to do there? Restructuring of cultivation. As an example, it was the time of, it was the season for cotton in Karditsa, and we had the floods there. So because of the floods, everything was destroyed. If they had other produce other than cotton, the disaster would not be so big. And then, of course, all the health and hygiene measures that need to be taken because of the parasites and the diseases, because in the past few years we've seen things that we did not have in the past. Then the loss of biodiversity, a lot of problems there as well. The pollinators can be mentioned at this time. Then we have the desertifications, a lot of things that need to be done. I need to move faster in this stance because we are lagging behind in time. The abandonment of agriculture. You know, in the United States, if you're a farmer, you are someone important. In Greece, it's not the case. The production cost is high, the income is low. So farmers and the age group that they belong in is actually high. So we don't have the younger generation bringing fresh blood and a new way of looking at things. More challenges: overpopulation, the food security, the sufficiency of food. Of course, there's a deficit there, but what do we have to do? We need further research as to the losses before and after the harvest. Before increasing the production, we need to find ways to preserve the produce. Then the food preferences, the consumption of meat and all that. I'm not going to further elaborate on this issue because the colleagues that will speak afterwards will have more to say on this issue. But I think that we need a campaign so that there will be no food waste. In the past, there was produce and there was consumption. Then we started asking for more things, so there was an increase in demand. Now we need to go backwards and actually demand what we can eat, no more than that. And then the expiry date, which is again very important for food safety. Some of the products that have expired are just fine. So we either need to find a way to increase or prolong the expiry date of certain products, or find another way to deal with the problem. We need to find solutions as to the genetically engineered organisms and see what we can do to replace chemicals and use other more safe products. What does ELGO Dimitra do about that? For the reduction of the food waste, we've started a lot of research programs. We are trying to prolong the expiry date, and so we need to work a lot more on the amelioration of the food chain. And then the after production loss. Why would I increase my production if my produce goes to waste? So I need to find better processes, better procedures, which means that the new varieties are very important. ELGO Dimitra in the past few months has started a very ambitious program on the improvement of the varieties that we cultivate. I will give you an example as I move on. The restructuring, we need to adjust to the climate change. So we need climate resilient agriculture. We need a differentiation as to the seasons and what is mature during specific seasons, and so on and so forth. There are 2 or 3 million streamers of cotton in the area of Thessaly. Do you know how much water the varieties that we have in Greece need? 500 kilos per streamer. You know how much that would be? It would be half, 280 kilos, based on other methods of cultivation. So if we manage to do that, I think we'll benefit a lot. And we've embarked on a very ambitious project to improve the genetic material in order to have bigger crops as well. I need to move faster again. I'm running out of time. Increase the arable land as well. This is important. There are a lot of people who want to get fields of land and turn them into PV areas. Let's not forget that our agricultural production is very important. So PV is a good thing, photovoltaics, but PV panels. But let's not simply focus on that. What does all that mean? In Greece, we have a problem in terms of increasing productivity. We have not done a lot of things. One of them, I think, will contribute towards our aim would be the development of a system of agricultural advice. ELGO has finished a system of this type. This was mentioned by Dr. Panagiotis, and I think that we will make headway. Then we need to improve the genetic material used, and then we need modern practices such as agrologistics, digital agriculture, circular economy, the utilization of biodiversity, and the production of food. Before I finish, I would like to say that the cycle of agriculture has changed nowadays. So here we have basically knowledge and innovation. Then we have a age group renewal, food efficiency, we have climate change, environmental impacts, a flexible agri-system that will need to provide a just income so that the agricultural and rural areas can flourish. For all of that, we have a series of ambitious programs, and we think that hopefully things will be better in the future. Thank you.
γιατί ήταν πολύ σαφή.
Thank you, Dr. Haroutounian, because you were very specific, very clear with specific proposals. It was exactly what we needed. And of course, he covered many regions here in many areas. He spoke about the restructuring of farming and a lot of other topics as well. So it was a broad range there. Let's just move on with the cooperation of two great researchers. We've got Dr. Dimitrios Vlachos and Dr. Eleftherios Iakovou, who will speak about food safety technologies for resilient farm-to-fork supply chains, lessons from a US-Greece collaboration. First, we're going to have Dr. Iakovou online with us, starting with Dr. Iakovou. Hello, Dr. Iakovou, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Αλλά
Χαιρετίσματα από Τέξας.
Best regards from Texas. It is 10 to 8 in the morning. Also, we woke you up quite early. No worries. I always wake up early. Thank you very much for being here with us. And the floor is yours for your presentation. And then Mr. Vlachos will follow. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really lovely to be with you, even online. Though I had promised Yanis I would have come under normal circumstances. Anyway, congratulations, Yanni, on your effort to coordinate and to organize this meeting. I am in charge of applied research. I teach at the Polytechnic here in the field of distribution mechanical engineers, and I'm also a professor at the supply chain management university at the Bush University. I am a member of the Aristotelian University of Thessaloniki, and I left a few years ago, like many other Greeks, to go abroad. Yanis asked me to talk about the strategic importance of supply chains and their resilience. I think we need to first of all define what a supply chain is. I have launched a project, an effort here in the USA in cooperation with the Aristotelian University of Thessaloniki, and my colleague Eleftherios Iakovou will tell you more about it later. Before I left Greece, I had created a European Center of Excellence funded by the European Commission. The pandemic is an example of how uncertain, how complex, and how rapidly changing the environment is. What do we do within the framework of a supply chain? We plan, we sell, we consume. You spoke about climate change. Indeed, there are many disruptions supply chains are faced with as well. COVID showed some dramatic disruptions in supply chains in terms of demand, in terms of real productivity. And for the very first time, after many, many years, and I'm talking frankly, for the very first time, both companies and institutions and federal organizations realize that the efficiency coping cannot be the only guideline for supply chains. and I'm talking mainly about just-in-time food supply chains, where many companies had to override. They had to stop using the data they were using. They had to supply to producers and consumers, not through their distribution centers anymore. Therefore, we need to understand how to create food supply chains and how to support microsystems of small and medium-sized enterprises for them to be integrated into major supply chains, for them to become part of bigger supply chains. And there are extrovert businesses in Greece which would deserve some generous funding, and they would also deserve some knowledge and training for them to improve their know-how and for them to be able to work with, to cooperate with international companies and access bigger networks of supply chains. I'm not going to talk to you about 2019 or 2020. I'm going to talk to you about the future. All research and development organizations and institutions say that we need to have we need advanced manufacturing, and we also need biomedicine and bioeconomy. And the theme of resilience of supply chains is very topical because the risks are many, cyber attacks, and we need to use data analytics to drive growth, to be able to see what will happen in a supply chain. When we go to it, to a specific, for example, a restaurant, for example, sometimes people say that they went, they ate, but they didn't feel very nice. So can we gather a specific data for things like that? So what is the supply chain resilience? It is the adaptive capability of the supply chain to prepare for the unexpected events, to respond to disruptions, see the 4 different stages of this cycle of resilience. So prepare, then recognize, detect rather, first prepare, then detect, then respond, and then recover, to recover and go back to the supply chain, because the competitiveness of a company is influenced if it doesn't participate in the supply chain. Anyway, so we have to recover and we have to support food security, which is different from food safety, meaning giving people foodstuffs with the nutrients that are necessary. And this is also important for the general security of a country. So we need to have visibility, we need to have flexibility, all parties involved in the supply chain, and we need to have transparency. Transparency is not to be taken for granted.
Έχουμε συνεργασιμότητα των εταίρων της υποδεστικής αλυσίδας.
And above all and most of all, ladies and gentlemen, we need to invest money. We need to try to find different suppliers in many different areas in the world, and this could become an opportunity for Greek startups and small businesses who wish to collaborate with networks abroad. This could be an opportunity. So diversified sources, in order to do such a thing, though, we need to have a supply chain mapping. We need to be able to map the supply chain to know where the suppliers of our suppliers come from. Is it easy to do such a thing? Let me give you one example. In 2011, following the tsunami in Japan, a leading company created a group, set up a group of 100 executives, experts for supply chain mapping, to try to understand where the suppliers came from, in order to understand how vulnerable they were in case of interruption of supplies from specific parts of the world. So it took the experts 12 months. It took the executives, the top executives who conducted the survey, 12 months to make this supply chain mapping, because there isn't enough visibility, and it is difficult to trace certain details. And this is what is currently happening, what many businesses are currently doing worldwide, despite the adverse conditions and the difficulties created by COVID. And I believe that such a thing creates huge opportunities for Greek businesses. We have globalized supply chains, and they need to be competitive. So they keep asking, in an environment of liberal democratic economy, they wish to have a higher return on investment, and many things are at stake. All supply chains who wish to have a higher return on on investment, ROI, vis-a-vis suppliers from China, from totalitarian states such as China or Turkey, undermining the Greek sovereignty right now. Anyway, we need to see whether they are able to create competitive supply chains. But I feel that the problems will start showing at the end of the year. So the E2E SCM has been complicated with the large-scale globalization. There are lengthy lead times, 4 to 12 months. And then we have lots of other issues, issues of production, labor issues, mistakes in data management, and foodborne illnesses, contaminations, salmonella, when it comes to green vegetables, and many other issues we are often called upon to deal with. The pandemic showed that there are many changes in terms of many different foodstuffs, and we have many changes in terms of demand, because it depends. It depends on the COVID-19 status because needs keep changing as the pandemic keeps changing. Many models used in the past to assess demand and supply real time and things like that are useless today. What does food safety mean? Food safety is important. 420,000 deaths annually in the world. We have 77 billion annual cost of foodborne illnesses in the USA, and we have food imports which account for 80% of the seafood, 50% of fresh fruit, and 20% of fresh meat. And we need new technologies, innovative technologies, to support the resilience of supply chains and protect them from pathogenic issues, but also to protect them from all the risks out there. And the risks are many. We need technical personnel, people who really understand what is going on. So can we imagine safe and secure supply chains? Can we imagine a world with such supply chains? This is the objective. We need to protect future generations. And this is our vision towards an engineering research center. This is an initiative that was launched a few years ago for sustainable supply chains for the agri-food sector. We want the partners of supply chains to have access to cutting-edge technologies and competitive technologies to allow effective resilience, prevention, and prevention of the problems, taking into account the regulatory requirements of the states. We also need to improve food security and demonstrate that we can save lives. This is where I will stop, and I will give the floor to Dimitrios. This is my last slide with the food supply chain mapping, and now Dimitrios can continue. Let me, this is the slide with the chain mapping. You see all the stages of production. I don't think I need to enter into details. We know how it all starts. We have the producer, then the seller or reseller, then the carriers, the processors, distribution centers, restaurants, consumers, the end users, so on and so forth. Now, following what Eleftherios has said, with reference to what needs to be done in order to face current problems, what I would like to point out, and I believe that this has already been made clear by the previous speakers, is that we need many different, we need a multidisciplinary approach. This is what we need. We come from the world of the engineers and organization and management of production and supply chains, but we need to work together with agronomists, with food biologists, and so on and so forth. I will talk to you about the tools that we could use. And here in this slide you see the toolkit that we could use. We have some classical tools for supply chains management. which, however, as Eleftherios has already said, have proven to be ineffective in periods of crisis. We need to use modern, current data, digital data, big data. Mr. Nichas, Mr. Zalidis spoke about all such things earlier today. And we need, of course, an analysis, a detection and analysis of all the information. We have the issue of the blockchain for data safety and security, and in order to guarantee the lower stages of supply chains. And then we have simulation tools and processes which can provide information about what if types of analysis, and this can also help in terms of policy making, having to do, that is, with the national or the European policies. So it can also prove to be of help in terms of policy making. Let me move to the next slide. There are 4 steps we could take into consideration in order to achieve the objectives that we have talked about, the overall safety, security of food, of supply chains. What do we need? We need secure data. And how can we achieve those? Do we need a central system? No, in order to be able to cooperate, we need to have a system which would start as a small and decentralized system, and which would then become bigger. We would keep building on it to make it, to expand it. So such a process won't be ready in a year. This would need to be an ongoing process. The tools that we are talking about require knowledge, and knowledge is gained through experiences, and at a certain point data will become more reliable, but we can't tell when exactly, and we can't foresee. Here we have an example having to do with data on supply chain. We see a supply chain starting from a producer to an open market, or through a retailer, and then another chain with many different stages that has to do with meat. We're talking about vegetables and meat because they are the most vulnerable, rather sensitive, if I may say so. And we're talking about a system which will register or record in terms of space and time all the stages, all the steps, thus creating a history of things to lead to specific conclusions. For example, the dispatch of vegetables from the wholesaler to the retail seller took more time. Why? Is there a reason why? Has the quality been influenced? Then we have the unstructured text data with information which can be traced online. For example, somebody says, I had lettuce the other day and I felt sick. If we gather more information of the type, like for example, in Thessaloniki, many people stated so, well, that can lead to an alert, an emergency, and we would need to try to understand why, what happened, where did they buy that specific type of lettuce, maybe in a specific supermarket, and so on and so forth. Then the second thing has to do with information and the utilization of information. It's not just about gathering information. It has to do with algorithms and artificial intelligence, algorithms that will be trained constantly, and we would need to learn how to trust them, for they will be providing reliable data to us, like in many other areas of our lives. Another important area is the area of the supply chain risk management. We can reduce the time from production to consumption. We can change the stages, so we can have short-term solutions, try to find alternative suppliers, so that in a period of disruption we will be able to supply the market through an alternative channel. And then another area that has to do with decision making processes and decision support techniques. Depiction is of paramount importance, but we need dashboards, we need images, real-time processing, real-time data processing to allow decision makers to decide. And this is not easy, because information on its own, by itself rather, does not suffice. This part of the visualization of a piece of information is much more important than we think. So, in reality, we are talking about a system. The project Eleftherios Iakovou spoke about has very ambitious objectives. It has to do with early detection, with prevention, with a detection carried out not just at the level of organisms or supermarkets or retail stores, but also at the level of consumers. A consumer with through his or her devices and sensors should be able to know quickly that something is wrong with a foodstuff. And 20 years ago, we had the Twin Towers in the States. So everybody started talking about supply chain risks. Risks are always there, but there are some major events which usually remind us of the risks. Now we are affected by the coronavirus. Even if coronavirus disappears next year, well, we will be alert for many, many years to come. So thank you very much for your attention, and we will be glad to answer your questions. And I'm very sorry because I took up more time than I should have.
I would like to thank the speakers for the very interesting presentations they made, and they highlighted all the problems that we might find in the food supply chain, along with all the things required for a flexible food supply chain. And they also suggested a set of measures and tools, mainly digital tools, through the use of big volume of data, through algorithms, in order to predict the various problems related to food safety. Now let us move on to the next guest, Dr. Skandamis, who, as we said, is a member of the BIOHAZ panel of the European Food Safety Authority. He's going to talk to us about the EU policies developed in biological hazards amidst and post COVID-19. The floor is yours. Thank you, Mrs. Dr. Tassou. I would like to thank Mr. Balakakis for inviting me. It's an honor, and I would like to thank you for the leadership because it is a very pioneering action, turning an event of the kind, which requires physical presence, into an event that combines all the new technologies. So at a global level, and focusing on the EU, I would like to speak about the policies that we have in place. Food safety started becoming a concern at the beginning of the 20th century, around 1900, when a group of, allow me to say, crazy scientists started testing and checking some substances. See, from what point onwards they became toxic. But this led to the establishment of the FDA governing the food safety sector. And it took about half a century for this trajectory, for the HASP to become a part of our lives in order to protect the health of the astronauts. It was, it gave us the opportunity for setting up the joint committee of the FOA and the Codex Almae. And in 1968, we also had the implementation of the 7 principles of the HASP. Then 1997 to 2007, Codex introduced the idea of risk assessment, which currently governs the policies on food safety and food safety management. So it's an assessment of risks, an analysis of the risks. 2002, we had the first European regulation on food, and there was a band of measures on the health and safety of food. The food law was 2002. We also had the European Food Safety Authority, which were established. We got concepts such as traceability, and currently in 2020 we have the new regulations from 2019 underlining the role of transparency in assessing risks. On the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, so overseas, we had the FSMA for the safety of food and animal food, animal feed. Then the alteration of food, either as an act of terrorism or not, certification, and so on and so forth. And then we have the Green Deal, the circular economy, farm to fork that we heard today. Coming to the COVID-19, I do not know the way we have a BC and AC before and after Christ, but COVID-19 has definitely been a landmark. So HASP, as I mentioned, was something that we asked NASA to do to avoid the poisoning of astronauts. So this is how it was established. Then Pillsbury first published that in 1973. Then we had the Codex Alimentarius Commission, and that was implemented afterwards as the hazard analysis critical control points. That's what HASP stands for. This is something that all companies in the supply chain need to implement. In the past, that was presented in a linear way, but because of the various stages, and mainly it's the waste streams that you get, so the recycling of the waste, it's turned into a circle. So having a cycle here becomes even more important as it's related to our policies. Within the context of the supply chain, the European Union realized, as mentioned this morning, that 1 billion tons of food goes to waste, which is a big percentage of the global production. A lot of waste in the European Union, and this is attributed to the expiry dates and how we manage the expiry dates of the product. So apart from the measures that we need for the primary sector, we also need measures for the retailers and for the consumers to manage food safety. Informed consumer choices, I like calling that in English. So at this point, I would like to present you a slide that we have in conjunction with the Dimitrios Institute on the organic photonics. So we print these centers on the packaging material, and through the organic photonics we can see any microbes that might start developing, and there's a color indication as to whether the product is fresh, or whether it's starting to go to waste. So this is what we call smart packaging. From hazard, or according to the Codex Alimentarius, from detecting the hazard, then we move on to the risk. What does that mean? It means that we have the risk, which is the probability by the severity of the disease. Risk equals probability by severity of disease. So the severity of the disease might be related to the sensitivity of the consumer. So the hazard would be the shark and the risk would be the swimmer. So it's something possible, that's something that could happen. If the swimmer is a good swimmer, he might escape the shark. If the shark is injured, then the shark might not harm the swimmer. So, think of these possibility in order to understand whether it's possible for a type of food to cause poisoning. I shall not get into further detail, but by risk assessment we get the appropriate level of protection. The appropriate level of protection is actually the level of protection deemed appropriate by the member country, establishing a sanitary or phytosanitary measure to protect life or health within its territory. Salmonella was mentioned as an example. But in order to assess this risk, we need to have the analysis of the risk and the hazard. We need mapping of the supply chain, and we need to see how the various hazards increase or decrease from primary production up to consumption. In order for the food industry to do that, it needs to satisfy the so-called food safety objective, performance objective and performance criterion. So weighing its production processes so that the consumer will not be exposed to various hazards like salmonella, which is against the health target. To do that, we use various tools of predictive microbiology. Let me get an example from an opinion pronounced from the panel of EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority. And if we have how would it be safe to change the temperature of a product? So the theoretical process, including heat up and cool down times, we have a 90 degrees Celsius for 90 seconds heating process, whether it may lead to significantly different HAV inactivation depending on the process design. So if we apply one of these three colors, green, red or blue, you see that green leads to a bigger distraction of the virus. So in order to understand whether a process is safe or not, we need to quantify the result. And mathematics is a sector which is here to help us. According to Regulation 852, for meat, the temperature should be 7 degrees Celsius and no more than that. So this applies to meat transport. And EFSA was asked to see whether we can increase these 7 degrees Celsius without getting into any risk or hazard. So again, we've got more hazard on the pathogens on the surface of the meat. This is a sort of simulation. Risk assessment is there to use mathematical models and modern tools that we heard about in order to assess and understand quickly, give an assumption which is necessary for those testing and inspecting food and for the consumers to give them an indication as to whether the food is safe or not. Now, this slide, we've seen that numerous times today, from farm to fork. COVID-19 is not something that you get from the food that you consume. So this is not the problem there. COVID-19 plays a major role because it affects the health of the people who are part of the food supply chain. So what are the challenges to come to a conclusion? The challenge comes from globalization. What we have is the diffusion of resistant antimicrobial resistant pathogens. We have the whole genome sequencing. We have the demand of consumers for mild processing, the bioinformatic tools. We have the wish to foster biodiversity and the quantitative aspects. All that takes part in the One Health triad. So to guarantee our health, we need to make sure that for healthy people, we have a healthy environment and healthy animals. Otherwise, people will not be healthy because if through the environment there's a risk to health, this will get to people who are in hospital, and then people will infect more people. Before I finish my presentation, before I close, a couple of things I want to mention. The first one has to do with the PLOS1, 5,000 genomes per month in the United States, and we have tools to analyze the social networks, tools that, as you can see here on the left, can detect Listeria, which is strain A and strain B. They can see whether there's a geographic connection between the two, if there's a connection among the sources, and if there's a connection between the patients and the food that has been isolated. So we can use all these tools as a guide. And coming to the exposure of consumers, this is an example that we have from Listeria monocytogenes. On the horizontal axis, you can see the dosage. So the more you move towards the right, the higher the dose. And you can see that most of the items of food are not characterized by a high dose of Listeria. But the devil is at the tail, as the phrase, as the saying goes. So there's a very small portion of food items where the Listeria is very high. So here you can see the variability of microbes. A lot of things might seem identical, but they're not. Here you can see microbes, and we have them exposed to a cleaning material. Some of them will die and some will not. And here again, at real time, you can see a very interesting picture showing microbes after the heat up. When they become red, they die. If not, they remain alive. And if you see, some of them will gradually turn red, and then you will see one on the right, on the upper side, which never turns red. And this shows that some of them will be resistant to antibiotics. So if we do not take very drastic measures, in some cases they will become very resistant, and this is where the main problem comes from. So when man first landed on the moon, that was very important. It also affected the food safety sector. We made a lot of progress, but we should never forget the main ideas, the main principles, which are as follows: cook properly, heat up properly, freeze properly, and use the right suppliers, because it's not always the smartest person who will survive, but the person that can adjust better. Thank you very much.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ τον κύριο Σκανδάμι για την πολύ
We thank Mr. Skandamis for his interesting presentation. He introduced us. He introduced the notion of risk analysis and the notion of single health.
Netherlands Space Office.
Of the One Health that is. Now, Mr. Green will be connected online. Hello, Mr. Green.
Welcome you in Greece, at least virtually.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very sorry that I could not attend personally, but there are strict conditions on traveling here in the Netherlands, so I was prohibited by my government. I'm sorry for that. So I can start?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm working with the Netherlands Space Office, and I'm a senior advisor responsible for the G4AW program, which I speak about a little bit later on. And it's my pleasure to provide you in 10 minutes some highlights how Earth observation is used in the areas of food security and agriculture. And here you see a nice example of agricultural fields in the Netherlands, by the way. And now I have to go to the next slide. Yeah, it's not completely responding. Sorry for that. So the Netherlands Space Office is the Dutch Space Agency, and we have a steering group with 3 ministries and the Dutch Research Council, and we support education, research and innovation related to space. So we also procure high-resolution satellite imagery of the Netherlands for Dutch users, but especially also for agricultural purposes. As many space NSO participates in international collaboration, and we represent our government in the European Commission and ESA, European Space Agency, program boards. So this slide is a little bit setting the scene of Earth observation and big data. And first of all, with the European Copernicus program, that has been a real game changer by providing free and open satellite data. It stimulates innovation and economic growth for all kinds of purposes. And many services are now, in fact, supplied, making use of these Sentinel satellite data. But next to that, we have lots of other satellites. And the latest trend is that we have small satellite constellations that provide several times per day an image of the same area on Earth. Of course, these are commercial services, and you have to pay, in fact, for the image provision. So what you see, the Sentinel satellites are often used in many services because of the free price. But the satellite image is not providing, let's say, the information that is needed by a user. So what is needed to provide the service is that you combine the satellite data with all kinds of other data that is measured from other sensors. They can be in the field, they can be from the weather satellites, but they can also be provided by the people. That's the crowdsourcing. So what you will see is a trend where all the data is being combined. And of course, that is referred to the big data. And we do it here in the Western economics, but especially because of the free satellite data, we see now also that in developing countries, the use of satellite data is more and more being used. But there's a big challenge because users have a specific problem and specific needs, and the service providers come from technology. So the big challenge is how do you transform all this different data into a service that is usable and actionable for a user. And so not only in agriculture, it's in any market area. And behind that, there is another question which we have to bear in mind, is if we can have the technology in place, but then to provide a service needs also entrepreneurship, because you have to have the finances and the revenues to provide the service in a sustainable way. So there are big challenges to come to a service in agriculture. And last but not least, it is a warning for everybody working in Earth observations, is the users are really demanding. So it's very difficult to meet their expectations. So if we look to the Netherlands, we have all kinds of agricultural activities. Of course, you know the Netherlands from agriculture. But in the Netherlands, we have all kinds of different problems and needs with the farmers. And to a number of these problems, satellite data is being used as a solution. And I will go to some examples later on. We see that the satellite imagery is now also being used to monitor the CAP compliance. It's already done by many countries in Europe, and within European Space Agency project and European Commission projects, we are in fact improving the service provision from Earth satellite data for CAP compliance. And hopefully this will be implemented in the new phase of the CAP program. A very big problem in the world, in many countries, is the impact of drought on agriculture. And even for a country as the Netherlands, where you might think that we have a lot of water and rain, we had the last 2 summers large problems with droughts. With satellites, we can measure the droughts constantly in time and over space with a number of satellites. And even though the resolutions of the satellites are quite coarse, as you can see on the right top end of my slide, by combination of several satellite data, they can improve the resolution of these drought measurements to a pixel size of 250 by 250 meters. In the Netherlands, quite a lot of companies and research organizations are working on drought applications, also for agriculture and nature. If we look, let's say, not only to the Western perspective, we see that especially in developing countries, availability of water and efficient use of water is very important. Here we see an example of the VAO-WAPOR, which is a database which provides all kinds of parameters related to the water use and water efficiency in agriculture. The services is provided by a consortium of Dutch and Belgian organizations working together with IMNI from CGIR. And this specific project, by the way, is financed by the Dutch government. With satellite data, of course, we have a very good overview of what is happening in the world. And there are several initiatives that cooperate and collaborate and bring all the information together in, let's say, one system. And this initiative is called GeoGLAM, Global Land Agricultural Monitoring, which is coordinated by the Group of Earth Observations. So it's a kind of watchdog on agriculture and on problems in agriculture of the whole world, and in this case for 6 major crops. From the Netherlands, we understood that, let's say, a lot of the work on Earth observation is done by the governments and research organizations, but a lot of this information is not reaching farmers in the fields. And that is why the Dutch government has invested in an innovation program, which is called Geodata for Agriculture and Water, where we in fact invited public-private partnerships to develop services that provide information for farmers that they can use in their daily activities. When to seed, when to fertilize, and when to harvest. But also with this kind of data, farmers in developing countries can have an affordable insurance or can have access to credits. So we have 25 projects co-financed in 15 developing countries, and the target with this program is to reach 4.5 million farmers. And within these programs, all kinds of different services are provided. And again, behind these programs, there's the challenge of finding the right business model and finding the right partners to scale up. So one example from this program is a project that was executed in Uganda, providing a drought insurance for maize farmers. And the project has ended, and now a local company in Uganda, together with other organizations, are continuing the service provision, and they have reached more than 100,000 farmers that have an insurance. Another example that I want to provide as an illustration of the innovation with this program is a kind of navigation device, a TomTom as we call it here in the Netherlands, that helps pastoralists in West African countries, Mali and Burkina, to go from a place where there is a shortage of water and vegetation to an area where there is sufficient water and vegetation. It's the pastoralist calls to a call center and then receives the guidance to go from one place to another place. The service has been developed, and together with Orange Telecom mobile company, the service is continued, and they are also looking into opportunities to scale up to other West African countries as well. So what's next? What we can conclude from all these various projects that we have ourselves under execution, but also what is being done in many other programs in the world, that we see is that a lot of innovation is happening, and of course, together with more collaboration and together with parties that bring in finance, we can in fact reach scale. And this is a very important issue, because food security is a major problem in the world, and the farmers in a lot of developing countries lack access to right information, and this is one of the ways that we can help the farmers in accessing the right information to make the right decisions. So what is needed for that? So we need, in fact, that let's say in the early development in innovations, governments and donor organizations can step in by providing grants. But as soon, of course, the service is developed and the service becomes commercial, of course, equity will be needed for further scale up. So we see a lot of opportunities, and not only in the developing countries, but even in already developed countries. Of course, to close my presentation, of course, if this presentation raises interest or let's say to learn more about how Earth observation is used in for agriculture and food security, we have a lot of knowledge in the Netherlands available, and of course we are willing to share that with Greece partners. We are in contact with our embassy in Greece, and you might contact either me directly or you may contact the embassy to explore further collaboration. So I think this ends my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
We thank you very much, Mr. Green, for your interesting presentation. Thank you.
Well done.
Ο κύριος Γκριμ μας παρουσίασε πώς μπορεί να...
The topic of the last presentation by Mr. Grimm was on big data analytics, on food security, and that was the last presentation of the session. So we shall continue from this point onwards with questions. I'm going to start with a question in my field of work. And I would like to ask you, Dr. Skandamis, for the European Food Safety Authority in COVID-19, the fact that we said that the food sector is not responsible for the contamination, how did that happen? And do you think that the controls and the testing on the food supply chain was not, or the testing was not sufficient? What happened? For the European Food Safety Authority, let me start by saying that they moved very, very quickly in terms of mapping the literature that we had at the given time of COVID-19, because when we first heard about it, the literature was not sufficient, and there's continuous research on trying to identify how the virus acts. But from the very first moment, we realized that there was no foodborne transmission. So the European Food Safety Authority made that public on its website to begin with. And this is one of the personal remarks I would like to make, that by doing that, by making, making this public without focusing on COVID-19, it showed that COVID-19 was not directly associated with food safety. And this is why it is not continued with further declarations and statements, because COVID-19 is not something that you get through food. It's not a foodborne contamination. I had the honor to participate in two committees that drew up guides on the food industry and the analysis, risk analysis in COVID-19 era. So based on my experience from the Greek agency on food safety, I would say that it was on the same page as the European Food Safety Authority. They did not do anything that would insinuate or imply that there were concerns as to any foodborne issues and transmission of the disease through food. What they did, the only thing they did, was to protect the health of the people involved in the food supply chain. So it's not a foodborne issue, and that was that. Thank you. A question from the audience addressed to Dr. Vlachos. How are you going to stabilize the human factor? Making sure that people will act on a conscious basis. So I think they speak about the monitoring of the entire food supply chain. Well, the answer to your question would be for humans, and I agree with this observation, that human beings are a factor we could not predict. And if we want to reduce the risk there, then there should not be a person entering the data. This is why we use sensors, avoiding human intervention for entering data. To the extent this is possible, of course, you understand we cannot fully eliminate human intervention, and risk management is there to reduce and not completely eliminate the risk. Something else related to the food supply chain. We heard during the pandemic that there was this tendency from some countries to safeguard their resources. We heard about rice or imports. Is that an issue for the European Union? Do you have any piece of information related to that? I don't have any specific information. It's basically what you've read yourself. A lot of things are announced, but I do not know exactly what is happening. What we could say at the moment, because the issue here is how we can deal with similar problems in the future. Again, it's the same thing we mentioned during the presentation. We need to find new ways to tackle things. Yes, we're a global community. We believe we're a global community. So the pandemic actually showed that we are not. This is what the crisis showed. It highlighted restrictions, which means that we need to protect ourselves by having local alternative suppliers, local food supply chain. So if anything happens because of some external risk or anything, we will be able to safeguard and guarantee food safety and flow without any problems. Another question, I don't know to whom this is addressed. Although Natura areas are protected, and there could be no intervention therein, with the recent legislations and the introduction of PV panels and parks, the setting has changed. How does that match the protection of biodiversity? Let me add something on what was said earlier on. In Greece, we didn't have problems of the kind. There's a problem with the speaker's microphone. He doesn't speak close to the microphone. So for a couple of days, there were countries that stopped their exports, but that was enough for Greece. As for the Natura areas, yes, Greece is the country with the biggest number of Natura regions in relation to the territory. And mild interventions are allowed in Natura areas. I think there's a misunderstanding there. We believe that if anything comes under Natura 2000, then there should be absolutely no human intervention, but mild interventions are allowed. I do not know about the specific PV panels that you mentioned, because each area has its own regulatory authorities, but there's a new labeling currently on products originating from Natura 2000 areas produced under specific circumstances, and we want these products to be promoted. We don't want Natura 2000 areas to be without any life, any form of life. Thank you very much. I think we can end this session. If I may, I apologize. Yes, of course. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Tassou. If I may add something to what you mentioned, there's this tendency to localize everything. It's not just rice. I read something this morning that people all over the world who feel food insecure, who do not have access to food, the number of these people has doubled compared to last year. So in 2020, we have 270 million people who are food insecure. So the food supply chains since 2009 and the financial crisis became more and more local. What does that mean? If you take a look at statistics, in 2009, the percentage in the global GDP, it was up, then it started dropping gradually. I know I might sound like a Dutch technocrat, but there are specific trends within the globalization. They call them localization. So the tendencies of food supply chains to become more resilient. The sound is very bad as she speaks, so we apologize for the interpretation. I think resilience is a great opportunity, resilience of the food supply chains. And what we try to do through the national policies, which will keep increasing in the coming years, either through trade or higher tariffs, or through the decisions of the governments not to share food with other governments, etc. They support a setting of local supplies, which is an opportunity for Greece and for countries of the European Union or countries that are closer to it. But that comes along with a question, a big question for the suppliers. How can we make these chains resilient at a lower cost? So this poses a lot of challenges for the future, but it's also a great opportunity for SMEs in Greece. Thank you very much. It was a very good comment that you made, very to the point. So now we can continue with the next session on policies for addressing short and mid-term agri-food challenges. Thank you. Thank you everyone, all speakers.
Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ και τους ακροατές μας.
Η Αθηναϊκή Ζυθοποιία ιδρύθηκε το 1963 από μια ομάδα Ελλήνων επιχειρηματιών και σήμερα αποτελεί μέλος του ομίλου Heineken NV.
Πολύς εμπορικός και βιομηχανικός κόσμος παρευρίσκεται στη θεμελίωση των νέων εργοστασίων της Αθηναϊκής Ζυθοποιίας, που θα αρχίσει τη λειτουργία του τον Ιούνιο του 1964.
Με την ίδρυσή της λοιπόν και εφόσον υπήρχε και έτοιμο το οικόπεδο, εκδόθηκαν οι οικονομικές άδειες, άρχισαν να παραγγέλλονται τα μηχανήματα, άρχισε να προσλαμβάνεται προσωπικό.
Η μπύρα Άμστελ κυκλοφορεί την άνοιξη του 1965 και συγκεκριμένα την Μεγάλη Παρασκευή.
Την Παρασκευή το απόγευμα φόρτωσαν τα 4 αυτοκίνητα στο Ξαφνικό και γύρισαν τις 1 η ώρα με 1:30 τη νύχτα. Τα αυτοκίνητα αδιανά.
Η Αθηναϊκή Ζυθοποιία για μένα είναι η ζωή μου. Θα έλεγα, ας πούμε, έτσι λίγο να το παραφράσω, ότι αν ξαναρχόμουν ποτέ σε αυτόν τον κόσμο θα ήθελα να ξανακάνω αυτή την πορεία.